The rain hit New Orleans like bullets that night, each drop exploding against the uneven brick of the French Quarter, with a violence that seemed to mirror the city's restless soul. I pulled my thin windbreaker tighter around myself as I hurried through the narrow streets. My nursing shift at University Medical Center had run 3 hours over due to a trauma emergency, and my legs throbbed in protest. I should have taken the main road along Royal Street, but exhaustion had me choosing the shortcut through the dim alleys I'd walked 100 times since moving here. The street lamps cast weak, trembling circles of amber light in the darkness, barely penetrating the sheets of rain. The sound of an engine roaring too fast for these narrow streets made me look up. Headlights swept around the corner ahead, their beams cutting through the rain like searchlights. I pressed myself against the wet wall, expecting the car to pass. That's when I saw him. A small figure, no more than 6 years old, stood frozen in the middle of the street. The child wore expensive clothes, I could tell even from a distance, but they were plastered to his small frame by the rain. In the split second before everything happened, I saw his face, pale, terrified, his eyes wide with the particular fear children have when they know something is terribly wrong. The car wasn't slowing. The driver either hadn't seen the boy or didn't care. Time contracted into that strange, slow-motion state I'd experienced in the ER during the worst emergencies. My legs moved before my brain fully processed the decision. I dropped my bag and ran. The distance seemed impossible. The car too fast, the child too frozen. My hands connected with his small shoulders just as the car's bumper would have. I shoved him with all my strength toward the opposite curb, feeling his body lift and fly those crucial few feet to safety. The car's side mirror caught my hip, spinning me sideways. I hit the wet pavement hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs, pain exploding through my right side. The car screeched to a halt somewhere in the distance, tires shrieking against wet stone. I lay there for a moment, gasping, my vision swimming with rain and pain. Then training kicked in. The child. I had to check the child. I pushed myself up on shaking arms. He was huddled against the wall where I'd thrown him, staring at me with enormous dark eyes. "Are you hurt?" I called to him, my voice cracking. Before he could answer, heavy footsteps splashed toward us. Multiple people. The car doors had opened, and men were emerging, their silhouettes dark and imposing in the rain. I struggled to my feet, positioning myself between them and the child, my nurse's instinct to protect overriding any concern for my own safety. "Step away from the boy." The voice was cold, authoritative, vibrating with a power that made the storm feel insignificant. The man who spoke stepped into the circle of lamplight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that somehow remained crisp despite the weather, but it was his eyes that made my breath catch. Storm gray and cold as steel, fixed on me with an intensity that felt like physical pressure. "He's not hurt," I managed, clutching my throbbing hip, "but he needs to be checked properly. I'm a nurse." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. He moved closer, and I recognized him then. Not from personal acquaintance, but from whispers in the hospital trauma ward, from the way seasoned doctors averted their eyes when his name was mentioned. Darius Moreau. "Micah," Darius said, his voice softening fractionally as he looked past me to the child. "Come here." But the boy Micah didn't run to his father. He scrambled up and ran to me, wrapping his small arms around my wet legs with a grip that spoke of absolute terror. "No," he whimpered. Darius's expression changed, something dangerous flashing in those gray eyes. He looked at his son clinging to a stranger, then back at me. "You saved his life," Darius said, his voice deadly quiet. "That creates a debt. In my world, such debts are taken very seriously." "I don't want anything," I said quickly, though my knees were shaking. "I just want to go home." "You can't," he stated simply. "Not now. Not when my enemies know you've touched my son." He gestured to the open door of the SUV. "Get in. You're coming with us." It wasn't a request. One of his men had already retrieved my fallen bag from the wet asphalt, holding it open for me to verify before placing it in the front seat, leaving no trace behind. And as I looked down at Micah, still clinging to me, I knew I had no choice. I had stepped into the path of a speeding car and landed squarely in the middle of a world I wasn't prepared for. If you are hearing this and feel something in this story tug at a corner of your heart, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like and share this video so we have the strength to keep bringing you heartfelt stories every day. And if you do not mind, let us know where you are watching from. Leave a comment and tell us which part of the world this story has reached, because we treasure every word you share. The SUV sped through the slick roads, as if the storm were nothing. I sat in the middle row holding Micah, who trembled faintly, soaked and clinging to me, while Darius sat across from us in silence, his gaze fixed on the window as though watching a distant world. The air inside the car was thick with unspoken things as we left the city lights behind and turned down a long, secluded driveway lined with ancient oak trees toward a wrought iron gate shaped like the open jaws of a dragon. When the SUV stopped before a massive stone building, I felt my breath falter because it was not a house but a mansion built of old stone, with tall roof lines and heavy wooden doors wrapped in ivy like an ancient European estate planted on Louisiana soil, its tall windows glowing with warm gold that shimmered against the rain in a way both beautiful and foreboding. When Darius opened the door for me, I stepped out with waterlogged shoes squeaking awkwardly while Micah refused to release me. I followed Darius into the mansion, feeling like I was crossing into a world that did not belong to me, the heavy door opening to the scent of warm incense mixed with leather and aged oak. At the entrance stood an older woman in a dark brown dress with silver hair pinned neatly, her eyes sweeping over me and resting on Micah before she nodded once. Darius introduced her as Miss Ramona, his housekeeper, saying she would take me upstairs. She turned without waiting for a response, her footsteps echoing through a long corridor lit with soft light and lined with oil portraits that looked like fading relics of people long gone. The mansion felt less like a home and more like a living artifact breathing in silence and authority. When we reached the second floor, she opened a thick wooden door, revealing a warm, unexpectedly welcoming room with crisp white sheets, gentle golden lamps, and a neatly folded dry outfit placed beside a fresh towel. I froze, wondering how they knew my size, until Miss Ramona answered my unspoken question, with a quiet certainty that everything here was always prepared. After thanking her, though she had already turned away, I set Micah on the bed and gently dried his hair, watching him look at me with weary gratitude rather than tears. After showering quickly, the hot water easing the tension from my body, I returned to find him asleep curled like a small kitten. I pulled the blanket over him before sitting at the edge of the bed with my mind full of questions about where I was, who these people were, and what waited behind the thick walls of this isolated mansion, while outside the rain kept tapping against the glass like the slow knocking of a fate drawing near. The blurred morning light filtered through the curtains when I awoke the next day, my back still heavy from sleeping on one side to avoid the bruise along my hip. The room was unusually quiet except for the soft, steady breathing of Micah curled safely in my arms, his small face relaxed as if he had just stepped out of a peaceful dream. I gently slipped my arm from under him, tiptoed out of the bed and stepped outside the room. The hallway empty and silent as I made my way downstairs, hoping to find a kitchen or someone I could ask for a phone call. But the moment I reached the bottom of the staircase, a deep voice rose from the left asking if I had slept well. I startled, turning back to find Darius standing in the living area with a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf behind him and a glass wall opening onto a garden still soaked from the storm. His white shirt clinging lightly to his frame, his sleeves rolled up, his hair still damp. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady as I said I had slept well enough to survive and thanked him for letting me rest here, adding that I would order a taxi as soon as I had phone service. Yet he set his coffee cup down and stepped closer, his gaze as unreadable as it had been the night before, saying calmly that no one came or left this place without his knowledge, and that I would not be calling a taxi. His tone not threatening but clearly not a suggestion. I tightened my hand and told him I had work, that the hospital was expecting me, that I could not simply disappear. But he studied me like a surgeon, assessing a complicated case without lifting a scalpel, telling me that I had saved his son, and that meant I had altered the balance of a blood debt, something not taken lightly in his world. I frowned, repeating what I had told him in the rain, that I had only done what anyone with a heart would do, that he owed me nothing and I only wanted my life back. Yet he raised a brow, a flicker of something indescribable crossing his storm, gray eyes as he insisted the world I had stepped into did not run on simple moral logic, that Micah was his only heir, and if I had not acted last night the boy would be dead, and to him that was a debt no thank you could repay. I inhaled shakily before asking what he expected from me, explaining that I did not want to be involved in any of this because I was just a nurse, but he stepped closer until only a few feet remained between us, saying I was a nurse but also the only person Micah did not scream for in the night, the only one he did not push away when touched, the only one who had managed to reach him since his mother died, and that no therapist had ever changed that. Yet in a few minutes, he had clung to me as if I were the last piece of his world. I looked at him feeling a strange pull between reason and something I could not name, asking what I was supposed to do with that. He did not answer at once, turning instead toward the wide window with his hands in his pockets before saying I should stay here for a while, until he was certain no one intended to harm me because of what happened the previous night. until Micah stabilized, until he felt the debt between us was balanced. I opened my mouth to object, but fell silent, as I remembered Micah's terrified eyes under the rain, his small hands gripping my coat while whispering he did not want to leave me. And I thought of Darius's gray eyes, cold but never empty. Although I knew he was dangerous, and that staying was the most foolish decision anyone in my situation could make, I also knew that if I walked away now, I would be abandoning a child with a broken heart. So I nodded softly as though speaking to myself and told him all right, but I wanted to keep working at least a few shifts a week. He turned back, his eyes settling on me briefly before he nodded and promised I would have everything I needed, then walked away, leaving me in that wide room with my heartbeat slowing yet carrying the sense that I had just signed a pact with fate. That night I did not return to the original room, because Micah refused to leave my side even for half a step. When Miss Ramona came to take him back, the boy clung to my shirt in panic, whispering he would not go unless I went with him. I looked at her, then at Darius standing behind her, and found myself nodding again, as if swept forward by a tide I could not resist. We returned to that room for the second time in less than one day. Micah, refusing to release me, changing clothes in the bathroom before crawling under the blanket and curling against me with his head on my chest as if it were the safest place on earth. I lay still with one hand on his back and the other around him, feeling each soft breath settle after the storm he had endured. The room sinking into silence, broken only by the faint ticking of a wall clock. I did not know when I fell asleep, only that when I woke, dawn not yet fully risen, Micah was still curled in my arms like a lost child finally finding warmth after a long winter. I eased myself from the bed to wash my face, and when I came out he was sitting up, eyes sleepy but lips forming a small smile as he asked if I was not going anywhere. I sat on the edge of the bed and ruffled his hair, saying no, I was here, at least for now. He nodded and snuggled back into bed, hugging a worn, stuffed bear, and for the first time I truly saw that he was only a 6-year-old child living in a world no child should have to survive. When I went down for breakfast, Darius was already seated at the long table with a steaming tray of coffee and a stack of documents beside him, watching me as I walked in as though assessing something invisible. I sat across from him, wrapping my hands around the warm cup to chase away the morning chill. He said he would not ask if I had slept well because he knew Micah would not let me leave him all night. I smiled faintly without denying it, saying the boy seemed not to trust anyone here except me. He nodded, glancing at the file before sliding a cream-colored envelope toward me. Inside I found hospital leave papers addressed to Nurse Amara Vance, signed by the director granting me 2 weeks off with full pay. I looked up in shock and uncertainty as he explained he had arranged it so I would have the time needed, at least until Micah steadied. I did not know how he had done it or who he had called or what influence he had used, but it was clearly not a request, though it did not feel like coercion either. Something in me felt lighter knowing I could stay and care for the boy and step away from the exhausting shifts at the hospital. I folded the envelope and pushed it aside, thanking him but adding that it did not make me feel I belonged here, that I was still a stranger. Yet he crossed his arms and met my gaze without wavering, telling me I had crossed that boundary when I stepped into the rain last night, that I was no longer a stranger. I could not answer, because part of me knew he was telling the truth, while another part still feared believing it. After breakfast, I returned to the room to find Micah awake playing with a wooden toy car, his face lighting up when he saw me, as he ran to wrap his arms around my legs as though afraid I might vanish. I crouched, placed my hand on his shoulder, and smiled while telling him I was not going anywhere. This time the words were not reassurance but a real promise, though I did not know how long it would hold. The first 3 days passed in a quiet rhythm as though time itself lingered between the ancient stone walls of the grand mansion. Each morning I rose before Micah to wander the hallways, studying dusty frames and crystal chandeliers that shimmered faintly in the soft dawn. I did not see Darius during those mornings, only Miss Ramona bringing meals or offering a guarded nod when we crossed paths. The sense of being watched threaded through my steps, not through direct stares but through the invisible presence of tiny cameras hidden behind stone statues or tucked into bookshelves, unseen but unmistakably there. The air in the mansion always carried the scent of damp wood woven with a faint trace of black tea, as if the house breathed in a language I had not yet learned, while Micah remained close at my side yet slowly softened, giggling when I told him stories, tilting his head thoughtfully when I asked simple questions like his favorite color or whether he missed his mother, though I never asked about the storm or why she was gone. I saw in his eyes the shadows no 6-year-old should carry. One afternoon we sat beneath the back veranda where purple bougainvillea climbed toward the roof. I sketched a cat for him while he colored with wax crayons, his small fingers smudged. I asked how old he had been when he learned to write after seeing him print his name in neat block letters at the corner of the page. He looked up with a shy pride, as he said he had learned before kindergarten because his father told him he had to be better than others to survive. I paused at the word survive, but asked nothing, watching him write Micah Moreau with careful strokes, realizing that behind his quiet demeanor was a sharp soul, a child who had learned to read the expressions of adults before learning to trust them. Once when I dropped a glass in my room, the door opened within seconds, and a large man in a suit appeared, saying nothing, only checking the room before leaving. I could not be sure if they were guards or something else, but I understood clearly that I was not here as a guest but as part of a circle that needed monitoring. And yet every night when Micah curled into me seeking a memory of warmth long lost, I felt my defenses softening, the initial caution dissolving like rain sinking into earth. One night as he drifted to sleep, he whispered that if I were his mother she would never have left. I froze, not knowing how to answer, only holding him tighter, aware that I was not his mother but a woman who had stepped into the rain and altered the fate of 2 lives she had never known before. And somehow that had been enough for him to see me as his entire world in a way no child should ever have to. That night, after I had lulled Micah to sleep and was about to return to my own room, Miss Ramona appeared at the doorway, her face as expressionless as ever, except for a small nod accompanied by a brief message saying that the master invited me to a private dinner. I hesitated for a heartbeat before agreeing, following her down the stairs with my thoughts tangled, realizing that although I had been staying in Darius's mansion, I had never really sat alone with him for more than a few minutes, because he always appeared like a shadow at precisely the right moments without ever coming too close. When the dining room doors opened, I was surprised to find the space softer than I had imagined. A table set for 2 with a white cloth and warm candlelight brushing gently across the stone walls. No guards, no heavy footsteps, only him standing at the head of the table pouring wine. When he gestured for me to sit, I took the seat opposite him in a silence broken only by the faint clink of glass against wood, as I joked lightly that I was not sure if this was how the Mafia invited someone to dinner, trying to ease the tension creeping along my bones. He smiled for the first time. A real smile not shaped by control or courtesy, telling me he was not sure I was the type to be easily intimidated. I shrugged, saying I was a nurse and used to everything from blood to lies. He nodded without looking away as he asked if I liked the work, surprising me. I answered that often it was unbearable, but small moments kept me tethered. A child's hand gripping mine in the emergency room, or a patient exhaling in relief upon learning they would live. Those tiny fragments anchoring me. He fell silent for a moment as though hearing more than my words before saying he had once believed doctors wielded life and death, but learned that the person standing beside a patient when everything fell apart was rarely a doctor and more often a nurse. I studied him then, hearing something in his voice that did not belong to a man accustomed to command but to someone who had witnessed too much. He began speaking in a quiet, steady tone, like the pull of an unseen tide, telling me about his father, a man who never smiled, about a childhood shaped within stone walls and lessons on loyalty taught through fear, about the first time he saw blood spill from a gun when he was 14 and did not tremble, speaking of it neither as tragedy nor pride, but as inevitability. I did not question him, only listened until it became my turn. I told him about my mother, a woman working 2 jobs to send her daughter to college, about long days without enough money for textbooks and stepping into my first shift wearing hospital shoes with worn heels. Dinner arrived simple and warm. Italian dishes and fresh bread prepared by someone who cooked for nourishment rather than show. Neither of us rushed through it as our conversation drifted slowly, carrying its own quiet weight until I noticed it was nearly 10. I rose, awkwardly thanking him for the meal and for not stationing an armed guard behind me. He stood as well, his eyes softening as he said this place was not a prison but also not somewhere I could enter and leave without leaving something behind. I could not tell whether he meant me or himself. But as we held each other's gaze for a long second, I felt something shift, like a new breath stirring in the ever-present silence. I walked out of the room with my heart trembling not from fear but from the faint spark igniting in a place where no one expected warmth. The next morning, after that strange and unexpectedly gentle dinner with Darius, I went to the kitchen for tea and found Miss Ramona sitting alone at the long table by the window, her thin hands meticulously folding crisp white napkins as though each crease held a memory. The early sunlight casting gold across her neatly pinned silver hair. I was about to turn away when she spoke without lifting her head, saying that I made him eat slower, talk more, and smile. I froze unsure who she meant before approaching and pouring tea for both of us. When I sat, she finally looked up with deep, quiet eyes and asked if I wished to understand the man named Darius Moreau, not as an accusation, but as a simple truth I had not hidden well. I nodded as she set aside the last napkin and began speaking in a voice as slow as wind moving through old branches, telling me that 2 years ago, Darius's wife, Isobel, a woman who did not belong to this world but entered it through love, believing she could pull a man from darkness with the light of her heart, met him in Italy, married him in secret, then moved here to raise Micah and become the son of his life. I saw Miss Ramona's eyes soften, as though still seeing Isobel walking those very halls. But not everyone accepted a woman capable of softening a man who had never bowed. One winter afternoon, while Darius attended a meeting with the branches of his organization, Isobel took Micah into the garden, as she often did when he was away. An unmarked car slipped through a disabled security gate, 3 men stepping out, 2 seizing the boy while 1 held a gun. Isobel fought back. Miss Ramona's hands tightened briefly before she continued in a lower voice, saying Micah had been only 4 and saw everything. The moment the gunshot cracked through the snowy garden, the moment his mother collapsed with her eyes still fixed on him, the men vanished before the guards returned. When Darius came home, he did not scream or rage but sat beside Isobel's body for 2 days without eating or sleeping, as though time had stopped. Afterward, he rebuilt the entire security system, doubled the guards, pulled Micah out of preschool, and transformed the mansion into a fortress. I said nothing as my throat tightened while I looked out toward the garden beyond the window where vines still climbed the stone columns where she once stood, finally understanding why Darius carried such silence, why his gaze always seemed pinned to a memory he could not escape, and why Micah clung to me the first time we met, not because I was special, but because I was the first person in years who returned him to the rhythm of childhood. Miss Ramona sighed as she rose, resting a gentle hand on my shoulder, saying they were souls left behind in a storm, and perhaps I was the only one who did not run from them. I did not answer as a deep ache rose in my chest. No longer fear nor defensiveness, only compassion for lives I had once believed I was merely passing through, but had unknowingly become part of. That afternoon the sky turned clear, as though after days of drizzle and heavy air it finally released a long breath. Micah and I went into the garden where pale purple blossoms fluttered like thin paper in the breeze. I spread a blanket on the grass with crayons and blank paper beside us, while Micah simply sat watching, his eyes as still as a quiet pond, though the sunlight painted a soft flush across his cheeks and warmed the soft brown hair framing his face. I drew a ridiculous dragon with crossed eyes and crooked teeth before handing him a red crayon. He looked at me, then added a giant pink bow on its head. When I laughed, he covered his mouth as though surprised he had done something joyful. I leaned closer, pretending to scold that my dragon was a warrior and should not have a pink bow. He pressed his lips together before bursting into a real laugh. Not a smirk or brightened glance, but a full, clear laugh like a bell shattering the thick silence that had trapped him for too long. The sound echoed through the garden as I froze with the pencil still in my hand, my heart pounding not with worry but with an emotion so tender it stole my breath. I turned toward the second-floor window, sensing someone watching, and saw Darius behind the glass, unmoving, looking down at us. When Micah leaned into me giggling and asking to draw a crown on the dragon's head, I saw Darius lift a hand to his face, not to move the curtain but to wipe away a tear, making no attempt to hide it as he stood as still as a man seeing a piece of his own soul return. That night when I put Micah to bed, he asked if I could sing to him. Though my voice was not beautiful, I hummed an old lullaby my mother used to sing. He exhaled softly before drifting into sleep with his small hand still wrapped around my wrist. I sat there for a long time studying his face in the warm glow of the bedside lamp before pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead, knowing that from the moment his laughter rang through that garden, something between us had crossed beyond the realm of temporary, that I was no longer the stranger who happened to save a child on a rainy street, but something closer, deeper, essential as breath. And that from that night forward I was no longer staying because of a promise or a debt, but because my heart had made room for a little boy named Micah, whose first smile was like sunlight after a storm. 3 days after the moment Micah burst into laughter in the sunlit garden, the atmosphere inside the mansion began to shift, no longer carrying the gentle stillness of quiet mornings or the warm glow of nightlights along the halls, but instead a tense silence like the surface of a lake waiting for a storm. I sensed it first in the way the guards moved more frequently around the grounds, in the way their eyes followed me and Micah more closely than usual, in the way conversations abruptly stopped whenever I stepped unexpectedly into a room. Darius disappeared for a full 24 hours without a trace, his phone answered only by an assistant who said the master was in an emergency meeting. I asked no more, though my instincts warned me something was coming. On the 4th evening, while I sat reading Micah a story on the sofa near the fireplace, Darius appeared suddenly, wearing a dark coat with reins still clinging to the shoulders, his eyes hollow from sleeplessness. When I started to rise, he lifted a hand telling me to stay. moving instead to kneel before Micah, resting a hand on the boy's head as he rasped softly, asking if Micah could go upstairs with Ramona because he and I needed to speak alone. The child hesitated before nodding. Once the door closed, Darius sank into the chair across from me with the weight of the world pressing against him, telling me the Delacroix family knew I was here, his words slicing through the already heavy air. I did not need to ask who they were because I had heard the name whispered in passing among men in black suits. A rival clan, ruthless and relentless, determined to reclaim power from Darius's hold in the underworld. I asked how much they knew. He answered enough to know I was a new weakness for him and for Micah, his hands tightening as his steel-gray eyes filled not with coldness but with something deeper and fiercer as he explained someone in their ranks had captured a grainy, long-distance image of us at the park, too blurred to see your face clearly, but enough to mark your silhouette, your wild curls, and the specific beige trench coat you wear, spreading rumors that he had allowed a woman with no status and no bloodline to step into the center of his fortress, making them believe he had grown soft, vulnerable. A cold shiver trailed down my spine as I asked if he knew what they would do. He nodded slowly, saying an informant had warned him they were planning a kidnapping, either me or Micah, whichever was easier. Though I heard every word, my mind struggled to absorb it. The idea that someone might be hunted simply because I cared for a child, because I chose to stay, because I awakened emotions in Darius Moreau that had died with his wife. Instead of fear, the first thing I felt was anger, because I was not a hostage nor a pawn in the violent games of men who toyed with lives for power. Darius seemed to read my thoughts as he shook his head, saying he had never believed me weak, but that his enemies saw differently, that anyone near him could be used as leverage, especially me because I made Micah laugh and I made him feel alive again. I straightened, meeting his gaze squarely as I asked what he planned to do. Lock me away, increase guards, or let me disappear. He shook his head, saying he would not imprison me, nor allow me to vanish, but needed me to be extremely careful while he prepared a counterstrike, and until then every step I took would be monitored, not to control me but to protect me. I agreed without protest, anger dissolving into resolve because I was not leaving, not now. Not when Micah needed me, and not when I knew the man sitting before me was feeling fear for the first time in years. Fear of losing something more precious than power. News arrived early the next morning, while I was preparing to take Micah for a walk along the east grounds. Darius entered with a face even colder than the day we met, motioning for Ramona to take Micah away before closing the door and telling me someone had been kidnapped by mistake. A black woman with curly hair wearing a coat identical to mine, someone they believed was me. I asked her name with my heart pounding. He said Angela Morris, a cashier at a convenience store near where I had shopped days earlier, that they were hunting a profile, not a face. In the heavy rain and shadows, they saw a woman with your height, your hair, wearing a coat identical to yours, leaving the same convenience store, and they struck without hesitating to check, believing they had secured their leverage. I swallowed hard, imagining her face, an innocent woman now trapped somewhere, interrogated, maybe worse. I asked if they realized their mistake, and he answered perhaps, but perhaps not, and that uncertainty was the only thing keeping me and Micah safe, because if we reacted, if we sent anyone to retrieve her, they would know she was not me and would come back with greater precision. I stared at him in disbelief before rising sharply, asking if he intended to leave her there to be hurt because they thought she was me. Darius looked away to the window, saying slowly that if we made the wrong move, both Micah and I would be the next targets, and this was not an easy decision. I stepped closer with my voice trembling with fury, saying no one deserved to die in my place, especially someone uninvolved, that I could not remain behind walls while she suffered. Darius turned sharply, his eyes hard with fear and frustration as he insisted he was doing everything to keep me safe. I answered that I understood, and for that reason I would not hide, that he could have an entire army, but I had something his enemies could not predict. I took a breath before stating clearly that he should let me pretend to be myself. He stared as though I had lost my mind, asking what I meant. I explained that I would allow them to believe they had caught the real Amara, that if I walked into the trap they had set, they would release Angela, thinking their mission complete, and he could monitor me and intervene when necessary. He shook his head, saying it was too dangerous and he would not allow it, but I stepped closer, meeting his eyes without wavering, saying I was a nurse who had seen people die and come back, who knew fear intimately but also knew what was right, and that Angela did not deserve to die for me, and if I did nothing I could never look at myself again. And we both knew this was the only chance to expose the Delacroix family. He clenched his fists, torn in silence, until finally exhaling and agreeing under strict conditions, that he would accompany me, choose the location, craft the plan, and pull the plug at the first sign of danger. I nodded even as my legs trembled, my resolve steadier than ever. We began planning that very night, disguising me carefully so I would still be me but altered enough to convince them they had the right woman, choosing a trading site, an abandoned warehouse near the deserted docks where light could not reach but tracking signals could. Before I stepped into the car, I looked at Darius as he gripped my hand tightly, refusing to look away as he whispered not to make him regret this. I nodded with a smile I had not known I could muster, because this was no longer an escape, but the first time I walked willingly into the darkness to bring someone else back to the light. The car rolled to a silent stop near the edge of the road leading to the abandoned pier. Dawn not yet risen, as thick fog draped over everything like a faded curtain. I sat in the back seat wearing Angela's old beige coat, my hair tied into a tight bun, makeup muted to make my face appear paler, and beneath the sleeve a tiny tracking device the size of a seed lay flush against my skin, invisible to the eye. I left the car exactly as the shadowy instructions demanded, walking past 3 derelict buildings with no cameras, no lights, only my footsteps echoing across oil-stained concrete carrying the scent of rust. The large warehouse door hung slightly open as though waiting, and I entered, keeping my breath steady, though my heart hammered painfully. Within seconds, a harsh force yanked me backward, a thick sack thrown over my head as my arms were bound and my shoulder slammed against a freezing wall before I was dragged through darkness filled with mildew and metal. Eventually shoved onto a metal chair, the hood ripped away as a harsh overhead bulb burned into my eyes, revealing 3 men. One gaunt with bruised-looking eyes and thin lips, one broad-shouldered with crossed arms, and the last clearly one of the Delacroix enforcers. His stare filled with bitter hostility as he stepped closer, asking if I was Amara. I remained silent, earning a sharp slap across my left cheek that seared hot across my skin. Yet I stayed quiet as he ordered the others to search me for devices, their rough hands pulling at my clothes but missing the hidden tracker embedded within the lining of a thin metal insert. He began questioning me about Darius, about schedules, about access codes he imagined I possessed. I answered slowly with carefully prepared lies Darius had rehearsed with me, stretching time with forced hesitations and feigned panic, every passing second bringing Darius and his team closer. Then suddenly the warehouse doors exploded open beneath a thunder of gunfire. Shadows rushing in, voices shouting in a mix of Italian and English echoing across the steel walls. I ducked my head as hands still bound, glimpsing through my lashes the first figure running toward me. Darius, his eyes burning as he said nothing while he cut the ropes binding my wrists with a dagger from his belt. His hand trembling as he touched the bruised skin at my neck, and I whispered faintly that I was fine. The words soft as breath, yet enough to make him close his eyes for a fleeting moment as though waking from a nightmare. Behind him, his men had subdued the 3 attackers, one wounded and groaning, another pinned face down, and the leader bound tightly. Darius never took his eyes off me as he ordered his men to get Angela out immediately, saying she was alive in the back room. A guard sprinted away. I rose unsteadily, but managing to stand as Darius pulled me into his arms, holding tight as though fearing I might disappear. I let myself rest there against the scent of leather and gun smoke on his coat, feeling the rise and fall of his chest trembling with each breath. He murmured that I had aged him 10 years in 1 hour. I smiled faintly against his shoulder, saying that I had given Angela many more years of life and he had too. As we stepped out of the warehouse together, I felt something sealed behind us. Not just the heavy steel door, but the past and the fear and the shadows I had walked into and returned from. I realized I was no longer an outsider stumbling through someone else's fate, because I had chosen this path and lived true to that choice. Dawn was just beginning to rise when we returned to the mansion, the pale light bleeding through a thin veil of mist that wrapped around the grounds as if this place had never known the echo of gunfire or the breath of danger. I sat in the back seat, still trembling softly, adrenaline lingering in my blood, my hands clasped together to steady myself, while the smell of sweat and gun smoke clung to my hair. Darius said nothing the entire ride home, though. His hand stayed on my shoulder, a steady weight as if he meant to catch me the moment I faltered. When the car stopped before the main entrance, Miss Ramona was waiting with worried eyes. I gave a faint nod to reassure her before following Darius upstairs into the private sitting room he had never taken anyone else into since the day I arrived. A small, warm room with a lit fireplace, a dark brown sofa, shelves filled with worn novels, and a few framed pictures I had never seen before. He motioned for me to sit while he brought me a glass of water, my hands trembling as I accepted it. Silence settled heavy as fabric between us, until he sat beside me with the firelight flickering in his exhausted gray eyes, and spoke slowly, as though each word came from somewhere deep inside him, saying that from the day Isabel died he thought he no longer knew fear because he had already lost everything, and with nothing left to lose, nothing could touch him. But when he saw me walk into that warehouse and heard gunfire while I did not come out, he felt something crush his chest, The realization that he could lose everything all over again, and this time he was not sure he would survive it. I turned toward him, with my eyes already stinging as the scattered images of being hooded and slapped, and watching him charge in like a storm swept through me. Yet in the gentle light of this quiet room, I knew I was alive for a reason. Alive to see clearly something that had been glowing beneath the surface for a long time. I told him that I loved him. Not loudly and not dramatically, but as if naming a truth that had been waiting in the silence. Not because he saved me, nor because of power or reputation, but because he was a father who protected his son with every breath, and a man who knew regret and loved with a quiet strength born of scars. Darius did not answer immediately, but looked at me for a long time as though he needed to be certain this was not a vision left behind by some lingering nightmare. Then he stood and walked to a small drawer, retrieving an old velvet box which, when opened, revealed not the massive diamond one might imagine belonging to a mafia boss, but a simple ring with a pale blue stone set in silver softened by time. He said it had belonged to his mother, that he had kept it for more than 30 years, and now he wanted it on the hand of the first woman who made him believe his heart could beat again. He knelt, not with pomp or theatrics, simply and humbly, asking me to stay with him not just in this house, and not only to care for Micah, but to stay as his wife and as the woman he chose for the rest of his life. I did not cry or laugh, only extended my hand for him to slip the ring onto my trembling fingers where the cold metal warmed quickly against my skin. As he held my hand, I understood that this was no longer about power or survival, but about love reclaimed after loss. The wedding took place on a soft weekend afternoon in the small garden behind the Moreau mansion, where Micah's first true laughter had echoed after months of silence. There were no grand piano melodies or choirs or prestigious guests from powerful families, only a handful of loved ones standing in a quiet circle among white roses that had just begun to bloom. Miss Ramona in her faded lavender dress, holding a bouquet she fashioned herself from garden flowers. Micah between us in a tiny vest that made him look like a miniature gentleman, though his bright eyes betrayed his overflowing joy. I wore a simple white dress with a soft V neckline and no lace or sparkle, just smooth, light silk matching the quiet trembling in my chest, while Darius stood beside me, holding my hand with the same fierce tenderness I had seen in him the first night we met in the rain. Though the officiant's voice carried through the still air, I hardly heard the words, only the sound of Darius's heartbeat through our joined hands, and the warmth of Micah's gaze and the gentle scent of orange blossoms and jasmine drifting from the garden. When the vows ended, Darius pressed a kiss not to my lips but to my forehead, a gesture of reverence so deep it loosened something inside me like a lake calming after a storm. And then came the moment that will live in me forever as Micah tugged at my dress, looking up with wide eyes and a voice trembling with hope as he asked if he could call me Mom. My heart paused before I knelt to gather him into my arms, hiding my tear-soaked face against his shoulder as I whispered that of course he could, that I would be his. Mom always. The garden erupted in applause, whistles, and laughter, tangled with tears from people who had spent years surviving in silence and fear. Guards and cooks and staff standing at the edges of the garden clapping as if witnessing a miracle they had never dared imagine. Miss Ramona embraced me with a long trembling hug, whispering that light had finally returned to this family. I realized that from nurse to mother, from outsider to the woman who stepped into the hearts of a father and a child shaped by darkness, I had come further than I ever imagined. In that moment, with Micah's arms around my waist and Darius's hand firm on my shoulder like a promise that would never loosen, I knew I had come home. Not to a room, but to a love and a responsibility and a new life I was ready to guard with everything I had. No longer an observer, but an essential part of this family, mother to a child who once feared the light, wife to a man who once lived in silence, and the one who brought hope to a place where darkness once reigned. 3 months after the wedding, the secluded mansion no longer felt like a hiding place for a mafia king, but had softened into a true home filled with laughter, the smell of morning pastries, and gentle afternoons in the sunlit garden. My belly had begun to show beneath the flowing silk dresses that no longer concealed the small movements inside me. Darius had grown more attentive not only to me but to Micah, often setting his work aside to join us at dinner or read bedtime stories when my back ached so badly I could barely sit upright. Yet the greatest change came one quiet evening beneath the high moon and the soft chorus of crickets in the yard when he sat beside me with his hand resting lightly on my belly as though feeling a miracle he never dared hope for again. After a long silence, he said there was something he needed to tell me, that he wanted to step away from the underworld. I turned to him without speaking. He nodded, saying he had spent half his life in darkness, with each day possibly his last, but now he had me and Micah and a life stirring beneath my skin, and he did not want these children to grow up in fear, believing it normal to carry knives or glance over their shoulders. that he wanted them to go to school and play in parks without bodyguards watching from the shadows. I squeezed his hand without speaking as he continued that Salvador, who had stood with him for more than 10 years, was the man he trusted most. Someone with enough strength and integrity to stabilize the order without bloodshed. That he would not disappear entirely but step back into an advisory role rather than a commander. The exit planned carefully, step by step, leaving no cracks for enemies to exploit. I nodded, feeling a breeze move gently through my heart, thinking of Micah, who had returned to school, a small one away from the city noise with a wide yard and a classroom of only 10 children, still watched discreetly by a guard but far more emotionally secure, his nightmares fading into innocent questions about the baby in my belly and whether it would like Lego blocks or share a room with him. Each morning he bent down to whisper greetings into my belly before announcing confidently that the baby definitely loved chocolate because I had eaten countless chocolate bars each week. Darius still worked with Salvador in the study, but spent more and more time at home, learning to tend the flower garden with me, helping choose names for the baby, even beginning a long letter to a priest in Palermo asking to restore Isabel's grave as a gentle way to close the previous chapter. Though I did not know what the future would bring, I knew that in this moment I was living in a new kind of peace. Not the silence born of fear, but the stillness rooted in love, and in the brave decision of a man who had lived too long in darkness. When the afternoon sun cast our 3 shadows across the living room wall, I understood that sometimes the greatest power comes not from weapons or reputation, but from knowing when to stop in order to protect what truly matters: family, love, and the fragile peace that belongs to our small corner of the world. The family council was held in an old estate on the outskirts of Baton Rouge, where walls that had stood for centuries had witnessed countless negotiations, betrayals, and spilled blood. Yet this time there was no scent of danger, no veiled threats, no calculating glances, only a solemn stillness that waited for a declaration foretold months earlier. Darius walked into the great room where the most influential members of the Moreau family and their allied branches were already seated, dressed in a simple black suit without the ring of power and without the escort of guards, carrying only the steady weight of his gaze and the low, even voice with which he delivered his final decision. He spoke of the past, of the things he had done to protect his family, of the cost of power, and of the undeniable reason that had led him to step out of the darkness. Salvador, the young man who had long served as his trusted right hand, was introduced as his successor, standing beside him not out of fear but out of respect. Nods of agreement spread slowly around the table, with a few furrowed brows and murmured whispers, yet no opposition. They all knew that no one was more capable or more principled than Salvador to maintain the fragile order among the family branches without spilling more blood. The old enemies who had once kept Darius awake at night were no longer threats. After their failed attack on Amara, the Delacroix family had been abandoned by their own allies, their leader disappearing without a trace amid rumors that he had been eliminated by the very people who once protected him for breaking the sacred code of silence. A new order had not only been restored but solidified, for the heirs now understood the consequences of pushing beyond the limits. When the meeting ended, Darius rose slowly, not in haste, not in pride, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had finally set down a weight that had shadowed his entire life. He did not look back as he stepped through the heavy doors. The car took him home to the walled estate as the sun was setting, the last light of day washing every branch and stone in a warm gold that glowed through the windows of a place that had once been a fortress and had become a home. The large gates no longer had guards. Several cameras had been removed. The high walls were softened by vines climbing over the old cracks. In the yard, Micah was playing with the small dog Darius had given him on his 8th birthday, the boy laughing as he ran toward the car and was lifted easily into his father's arms. On the porch, I sat on a wooden chair with my round belly rising beneath my dress, a warm cup of ginger tea in hand, smiling as I watched them. When Darius reached me, he bent to kiss my forehead and let his gaze linger on my stomach longer than usual. He said nothing, yet I could see the relief, the gratitude, and the rare tenderness that had scarcely touched his features in earlier years. He had done what few in his world had ever managed. He had stepped out without being dragged back, and more importantly, he had stepped out with both hands holding tightly to those he loved most. From that day on, Darius no longer lived as a man in the shadows. He became a true husband, waking early to help me make breakfast, taking Micah to school on special mornings, attending prenatal classes with me, listening to the heartbeat of our baby during each appointment. He laughed more, spoke more to the staff at the estate, and read to Micah every night, even if only a few pages. The estate was no longer a fortress guarding secrets. It became a place full of life, where every corner held memories, laughter, and hope. I had once believed that Darius Moreau would forever belong to a world without light. Yet he had only needed one compelling reason to stop running, and that reason was family. Naomi Moreau was born on a late autumn morning, while red leaves drifted gently outside the window of the quiet private hospital near our home. The labor arriving a few days early, but with enough time for Darius to panic in a way I had never seen before. Unable to find his shoes while Micah held my hand the entire ride to the hospital, both excited and trembling. When Naomi's first cry filled the room, Darius stood beside me in stunned silence, his hand clutching mine, his eyes shining with tears he did not speak into words. She was tiny, her reddish-brown skin soft as silk, her curls dark and wild, her eyelids squeezed shut as if taking her time entering the world. I could not stop looking at her, and Darius stood there as though time had frozen, every other sound fading around us as he finally held her in his arms for the first time, a tenderness in him I had never witnessed. She was named after Darius's grandmother, a woman deeply respected in the family for her kindness and strength, a name that carried both tradition and the promise of a new beginning. When Micah met his sister, he entered the room with wide eyes, clutching the stuffed rabbit he had prepared for weeks. He climbed onto the bed beside me without a word, gazed at her small face, and whispered as though afraid to disturb the holiness around us, that he would protect her, that he promised. I gathered them both into my arms, feeling my heart expand into a place I had never known. From that moment, Micah seemed to grow older overnight, calm and attentive, always eager to help, rocking her gently to sleep, or scolding Darius with a seriousness far older than his years when his father forgot a feeding time. He was no longer a boy shaped by past wounds. He was a proud older brother, guided by instinct and love. Each morning, Darius woke earlier, not to answer reports or calls as he once had, but to carry Naomi around the garden as the sun rose, reading snippets from the morning paper or singing old songs in a voice that was not particularly melodic but always enough to soothe her. Once, I found him standing before the tall mirror in the living room, with Naomi asleep on his chest, whispering to himself as though the words were too fragile to speak aloud, that for the first time he knew what it felt like to have a real family. Not a network of loyalties or handshakes in the dark, but the strange, ordinary miracles that allowed him to set his knife down at the dinner table and pick up a bottle of milk instead. The estate was no longer haunted by old ghosts. It had become a living home, where sunlight streamed through open windows, where music from Micah's piano lessons drifted down the halls, where life unfolded slowly and completely. People in town no longer spoke of the Moreau family with fear, but with curiosity and then admiration. A man once forged in darkness, a black woman from New Orleans who had known only hospitals and night shifts, a little boy who had lost his mother too soon, and a baby girl wrapped wholly in love had become symbols of rebirth, of a story no one expected would end in warmth. And I, watching the three of them playing in the garden as the late afternoon sun spilled gold across the grass, understood that sometimes love is not the thing shaped by reason or plan, but the one remaining truth after everything else has fallen away. A family, even one born from blood and grief, can still end in laughter and light. 3 years after that autumn afternoon when Naomi was born, our family sat together on the front porch looking toward New Orleans, where the sunset stretched across the sky like a long ribbon of amber silk draped over the city. Micah was now nearly 11, taller than before, yet still carrying the same gentle softness in his eyes. Naomi rested in my lap, her small hands gripping the picture book she insisted on holding every night. Darius sat beside me, his arm draped behind my back, the warmth of him feeling like something the world had always promised. In the quiet, with the faint hum of late summer cicadas lingering somewhere in the distance, Micah suddenly looked up, his voice serious but full of curiosity as he asked his father to tell him once more how he first met me. Darius let out a soft laugh, his gaze drifting to someplace far away as if the memories were carved so deeply into him that they still felt like yesterday. He nodded gently, then began to speak in that low, warm voice he always used whenever Micah needed a bedtime story. He told him it was a night of heavy rain, the kind that struck the old bricks of the French Quarter as if the whole city was screaming out its secrets. I had just finished a long shift at University Medical Center, exhausted enough that instead of taking the main road, I turned into the narrow alley I had walked through hundreds of times before. And there, in the downpour that turned everything into a curtain of white, was Micah at only 6 years old, standing motionless like a small shadow. A car came speeding toward him without any sign of slowing, and I, without knowing who he was, ran toward him, driven only by instinct. That one instinctive act changed his life, changed mine, and changed Darius forever. If I had not stopped, If I had taken the main road instead of the familiar little shortcut, there would be no evening like this, no laughter from Naomi, and no look of love in Micah's eyes as he leaned into his father. Micah pressed his head against Darius's shoulder and whispered that he never got tired of hearing that story. Naomi yawned softly in my arms, and as I looked at the two of them, I wondered how I had gone from being a lonely nurse in a rain-soaked city to becoming the wife of a man once known as a mafia figure and the mother of 2 children I loved more than my own breath. Our story began with blood, tears, and danger, but it ended with healing, forgiveness, and a whole family. And perhaps if there is one message I want to leave for those watching this video, it is that sometimes the greatest turning points in life come from the moments we least expect, from the smallest act of courage in the most frightening instant. Each of us carries the ability to become a guiding light for someone, even for ourselves, if we refuse to turn away from what is right. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this emotional story. If it touched your heart, please like and share it so its message of humanity can reach many more people. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you can continue to journey with us through touching and meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did anything in it remind you of your own life? We would love to read your comments, reflections, and the truest thoughts from deep within your heart. Leave a comment below so we can stay connected through every story we share. Farewell for now, and see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching good health, joyful days, and a peaceful life. Goodbye, and until next time.